Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Daniela Fayer. I'm the publisher of Government Executive Media Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's viewcast entitled Optimize Your Operations by Rethinking Federal Workforce Services Contracting. Events like this wouldn't be possible without the support of our underwriters, so let me take a moment to recognize the exclusive underwriter for today's event, Accenture Federal Services, as well as our research partner for today's event, Government Business Council, which is the research department within Government Executive Media Group. Before we kick off today's viewcast, just a few brief announcements for the audience that's viewing. Please submit your questions at any time by tweeting at us during the discussion using hashtag FederalBPO. At the end of the viewcast, the panelists will have time to answer some of your questions. And on Monday, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording of today's viewcast. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues and others who may not have been able to join us this afternoon. And now let me introduce our panelists for today's discussion. I'm very pleased to have with us today Andrew Jackson. He's the Assistant Secretary for Management for the Department of Education. In this role, he's responsible for leading the department's overall management agenda, working to promote the integration and transparency of department-level operations to strengthen the human resources function and improve employee engagement. We also have Ned Holland, former Assistant Secretary of Administration with the Department of Health and Human Services. He has had the responsibility for the leadership and management of approximately 3,800 federal employees and contractors operating 12 separate budgets totaling almost $1.4 billion. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Kevin Greer is going to lead our discussion. He is the Managing Director with Accenture Federal Services Management Consulting Practice, leading federal shared services strategic solutions. He has 23 years experience in federal financial management and management consulting services to CFOs and financial organizations. And he currently supports civilian, defense, and intelligence agencies' shared services transformation projects. I think this is going to prove to be a very interesting discussion, and I'm happy to turn it over to Kevin now.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm very excited today to talk about optimizing operations, and specifically how we can rethink the federal workforce services contracting. The premise for today's discussion is going to be based around federal leaders today are facing more than ever scope creep. We're facing situations where their missions are taking more resources and agencies are having to identify how they balance out their budgets. Sometimes their budgets are decreasing or staying stagnant, and they also are faced with the challenge of employee headcounts. Based on this, agency officials oftentimes will turn to staff augmentation in order to get the specific specialized skill sets that they need to deliver. Today, we'll be hearing from Andrew and from Ned on two great perspectives with two great agencies. I'd like to start by introducing Andrew and Ned, and then we will go forward with some of the results that we found in the study. So turn the time over to Andrew Jackson for an intro.
Great, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to talk about this topic. It's something that I've spent the last 6 years thinking about how to help government run better. I spent about 5 years at the Department of the Interior running shared services in the Interior Business Center and also standing up IT shared services in the CIO's office. About a year and a half ago, I came over to the Department of Education, where I've been concentrating on optimizing operations and other ways to help the department run more efficiently.
And I'm Ned Holland, and I'm also pleased to be here with our friends from Government Executive and Accenture. I came to the government almost 6 years ago from a series of corporate jobs in the private sector with Fortune 500 companies, where I always had central administration positions responsible for doing administrative activity ranging from HR to real estate to security to purchasing to the legal department. I ran all of those various functions in 3 separate Fortune 500 companies. When I came to the department, I was asked to run a thing called the Program Support Center, which is the largest shared services provider in the federal government. We provide services of a variety of sorts to virtually every major cabinet agency, and about 70% of the work we do is for enterprises outside the Department of Health and Human Services, but all inside the government. And we seek to provide a service, as we like to say, we are public servants serving public servants. We try to do the backroom work so that the front people do the mission.
All right, thank you. Today we're going to talk about service contracting. Service contracting consisting of staff augmentation, inter and intra-agency shared services, and commercially provided managed services. These are all common practices. We will then talk about how to get the most out of your business partners, specify the outcomes up front, how to better align cost with services, and how to hold service providers accountable. So in starting, I wanted to state 3 learning principles that we learned in doing a study with Accenture Federal Services and the Government Business Council. We interviewed or did a survey of 385 federal managers from 34 different government agencies. And through this, we talked about the use of services contracting. The first thing we learned was certainly that all of these agencies, majority of agencies, have a need for external talent. Being able to develop and do things in-house all of the time has proved challenge and proved to be very time-consuming. So most agencies have gone forward and have initially thought on a temporary basis to begin to use a staff augmentation model. This has been a challenge sometimes in the budget, in that staff augmentation, we found in some instances can cost can be as high as 80% more than employing someone internally. So today we'll talk about that mix of flexibility versus the requirement for cost savings. The second learning point that we recognized was certainly many government agencies are faced with a cap on the number of FTE and limitations. So to do that, 37% of agencies had mentioned that they supplement their headcount by going to external contract options using contract personnel. Not only is staff augmentation, as we mentioned, a way to be more expensive, but it's also is recognized as an area where there's high turnover. So you bring in external contractors, you train them up, and then there's a higher turnover than you would experience. Also the danger that there may be a reliance on the contractor in going forward and delivering your service. The third learning point in this study was that the benefits of shared services do exist. Multiple agencies had mentioned that the adoption of shared services, the ability to be able to eliminate a significant capital outlay initially in leveraging another agency's platform could prove to be successful. This is sometimes called platform as a service or technology as a service. The second area was the transaction services, and where an agency can provide transaction services on behalf of another agency. Sometimes transaction process as a service. The two combined can be a full service model for shared services, and in a shared service construct, maybe government as a service. 2 points was mentioned that federal agencies have the opportunity of using an interagency agreement, which can be procured quickly, and that was a feature that was liked. One thing that we mentioned was noticed in the study is that not many people recognize that they are using shared services today. So despite federal government using payroll and everyone being partakers of shared services, many people did not recognize that they're using shared services. So moving on to questions, I'd certainly like to ask both gentlemen if they felt that these study results resonated from what they're seeing within their agencies. Why don't we start with that question?
So I'll start. I think the description of downward pressure on budgets and headcount while there's increased demand for mission services is definitely a good way to describe what we've been experiencing at the Department of Education. I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of what we do. A lot of our programs are focused on both formula and discretionary grants. We're also one of the largest lenders in the country. We award about $120 billion worth of loans every year. We have seen in the last 5 years, our budgets have gone down approximately 8%, and our operations or program administration budget, our headcounts correspondingly gone down almost 7%. So you can definitely see that pressure. At the same time, the work has only increased. Just as one example, our Office of Civil Rights, which investigates civil rights issues within education institutions, both K through 12 and also at the higher education level. They've seen their complaints that they've examined over the last 20 years have more than doubled, but their headcount has actually gone down by 31%. So you're seeing a real disconnect between the level of resourcing that we're providing to these offices and the kind of pressure that they're getting to actually perform, and the pressure's never been greater to deliver the kinds of services that the country really needs.
Thank you, Ned.
And I must say, Kevin, that I was unsurprised by the conclusion that staff augmentation might be more expensive. That certainly was what I found in the private sector, where I really wasn't much of an outsourcer. I tried to do everything possible inside because I thought I could do it better, faster, and cheaper. And when I couldn't, I'd outsource. In 17 years and 3 Fortune 500 companies, I never had a budget that was anything other than flat or down year over year, never. And the result was that I got accustomed to this notion that each year you've got to do more with less. That is something that's only more recently, I think, hit the federal government and governments in general. We're going to have to learn to deal with it, and finding a way to do services in a variety of fashions is one of the ways to do that. I would distinguish on this question of shared services. There's 3 different things going on. There's outsourcing, having someone outside an enterprise, and in this case outside government, do work for us. A lot of that goes on. The second would be truly shared services, where one government agency does things for other government agencies or for itself, as in the case of what we do for ourselves. And then the third is insourcing, pure insourcing, deciding to engage in an activity of, by, and for yourself. And those are things which I did a lot in the private sector and which I think have some merit in the public sector as well. I don't think that we need to assume that somebody outside can do things better than we can do them. They might be able to, but they might not. And I don't think we should assume that there are headcount limitations. I went to one of our senior financial people recently and said, "Who says we have a headcount limitation?" And she said to me, "Nobody. I don't know what you're talking about. We have a budget limitation, and if it's cheaper to do something with our own people rather than send it to some contractor, we ought to do it that way." And that's, I think, how the government ought to be approaching it.
Okay. Now, I noticed in both of your backgrounds, Mr. Holland, certainly you have the Program Support Center with HHS, which is a deliverer of shared services. Mr. Jackson, you've worked with Department of Interior, a federal shared service provider. When we generally look at federal shared services that have been adopted today, it's been a fairly low uptick as far as the whole back office and mission-related services space. Clearly, payroll and HR have had some progress. They're looking at other areas. For those agencies who are looking at shared services and outsourcing today, and agree with your definitions on shared services being performed on behalf of your organization by either an internal or an external agency, what advice would you give leaders for options of increasing or meeting their mission demands while trying to balance their budget and their headcount while looking at shared services and outsourcing as an option?
Well, I think you have to cast aside assumptions and calculate what you actually can do. And then I think it's very important, and Andrew and I are both involved in some efforts to do this, that leaders across the government work together, get to know each other, find ways to understand and trust each other. That will lead to the implementation of real intergovernmental shared services. Frankly, I think rather than worrying about the competition in the shared service groups, we, the government, ought to be thinking like a collective purchaser. There's a term for that. It's called monopsony, only it's legal when the same enterprise does it. And we should be out there using our economic clout to buy whatever we have to buy from the private sector and then provide ourselves services internally. And frankly, it's only going to be over time that culture begins to build itself into the system.
Okay.
I think Ned said very well. There's a tendency, I think, of a lot of agencies to believe that when they control a service, they somehow get better service. I think there's a fallacy of thinking. And I think a lot of it has to do with that sort of myth of control. In reality, in many of these services, there's a tendency to think that because the mission is unique, the sort of back office admin functions are also unique. And I don't think that's really true when you boil it down. There are attributes that can be accommodated in a number of models. And when you cast aside assumptions, as Ned suggests, it allows you to really look at how could we find some very common support functions that could be provided in a shared services model. I think the reason why a lot of agencies tend to want to maintain control is they haven't necessarily had great experiences. They've found that when they go to shared services, the cost goes up and the quality goes down, and there's some historical baggage there. There's also this idea that staff augmentation allows you to maintain control, and that's the beauty of it. On the plus side, you do maintain control. On the downside, you still have to worry about providing the service. If folks can build kind of the relationship of trust that Ned is talking about, there's the ability, I think, to pick up the phone and call when an issue comes up, and you can overcome some of the historical challenges. There's also, I think, the ability to let somebody who has the capacity, the wherewithal to provide tier one, first class administrative support services, to actually take that off your hands and really avoid the strain on management resources that it really requires to run both mission and also mission support.
All right. So historically, adoption for shared services and adoption has been, and outsourcing, has been very low. Despite those constraints, what do you think agencies could do to better look at those models and try to adopt?
Well, the Department of Health and Human Services operates a thing called the Program Support Center, which is in fact the largest shared service provider in the government. And what we've done and continue to do, and my colleague Paul Bartley, who runs it, does, is create an environment in which we think in terms of increasing revenues. Now, you say, wait a minute, what's revenue increase got to do with the government? Well, in this case, increasing revenues is a measure of success. When you provide a service, if you do it well, the person to whom you provide it, or the enterprise to which you provide it, suggests to others that they use you, and the result is a continuing uptick in revenue. So while revenues aren't really the point, they're just a measure, we are working with our staffs to better provide the services, to be responsive to customers. We measure things like market share and revenue growth and customer satisfaction. All of those are things that customer service organizations in the rest of the economy look at routinely. We have to do the same, and over time that will begin to develop the concept of shared services, I think.
And I would say, for my part, I've been fortunate to be able to have experience on both sides of the divide, both being a shared service provider and a shared services consumer. At Interior, I spent 5 years helping to run the Interior Business Center. Now that I'm at the Department of Education, we're a customer of the Interior Business Center, and that's given me a really interesting perspective on what it feels like to be on both sides of the equation. And I will say that one thing that I found consistently is that it is virtually impossible when trying to convince folks to consider shared services to sell them on the idea of cost. the idea of using shared services to reduce their costs, which I believe there is true value there, and cost is in fact a driver, but on an emotional level, it never connects with the customer. And I think the only way that shared service providers can really connect with their customers is to really sell them on value and capability that they would not otherwise have. I'll give an example. It's very clear to me now that I'm a customer at the Department of Education that if we were to build our own payroll system, and shocking as that may seem, even though we're the smallest cabinet level agency, there's the theory that we could do it ourselves and do it better, and we could customize it to our needs. It's patently clear to me that doing so would not only cost more, we'd run it less efficiently and certainly less securely than buying into a payroll service that is operated on behalf of more than 100 other federal agencies. So, it's that kind of capacity that we would not otherwise have access to that really demonstrates, I think, the value of the model. And it's certainly, if you can prove the model in one area, you should at least, consider whether it's possible to extrapolate the model into other areas where there are similarly common administrative support needs that could be provided by an external provider.
I'd like to sign on for and emphasize something that Andrew said. He observed that these kinds of services really don't differ much from one agency to another, from one sub-department to another, from one business unit to another. One of the few advantages I may bring to this is that I've worked with all kinds of enterprises all over the country. Before I worked at those 3 Fortune 500 companies, I practiced law for 24 years, and every client I ever had told me, you have to understand, Ned, we are unique, we have special needs, we're different from all those other clients of yours, and you have to treat us that way and you have to recognize it. Well, not having been born yesterday, I acknowledged that was what they said. I learned about their business so I could talk about it at a cocktail party level. But when I went back to my office, every single time, they were more alike than they were different. And then I got into 3 Fortune 500 companies, and I heard the same thing from the businesses. We're all different. We do things different. The wireless division does it different than the wireline division. But when I got back to the office, the things I did for them were indistinguishable. And I've now found that in 6 years in the federal government. We have to overcome that tendency to believe that each of us is unique and understand that there are things, particularly these administrative services, that are common across enterprises and which can be done more effectively, more efficiently, better on a consolidated basis.
Great. I'd like to shift gears now and look at it from the customer perspective. Andrew, you had mentioned that you and the Department of Education are now a consumer of shared services. If you're looking at a services contracting option, maybe shared services, how can you receive the most value from your business partner? What would you like to see in the deal to receive the most value?
Well, I think it's really important to be clear on what outcomes you're trying to drive to. I think sitting down and having some frank conversations about what is really what the shared service provider can actually take off your plate, and being really open to letting them take as much as they can. In other words, I think what tends to happen is that something gets moved, a function is moved to a shared services model potentially, and yet there remains a kind of a shadow organization that stays, sort of spun up, ready to take over at a moment's notice if there's some sort of an issue that arises. It's part of that letting go of control. It's also, in some ways, potentially smart business practice to just maintain a, kind of cutover capability. But you don't really maximize the value of the relationship if you don't fully embrace the breadth of services that are being offered by the provider, and it also, I think, makes it harder to really realize the economic value of the relationship. So I think sitting down and talking about what the provider can do for you and how much of a particular function that you are in fact transitioning you could ask the shared service provider to provide. Those are two sort of key points that I would try to make to somebody who's looking to potentially explore the value of a shared services relationship.
All right.
And once again, Andrew's tweaked something in my mind that I want to, again, sign on for and emphasize, and that's this whole business of shadow staffs. It's true in HR, it's true in IT, it's true in security, it's true in almost every function. And the executive leadership has to commit itself to say, no, we don't need to replicate that work. If we're going to go to some other provider, whether it's a shared service provider inside government or even if it's to outside, we need to commit ourselves to the notion that we're really going to do it and not maintain a continuing shadow presence. Now, I must tell you, so, oh, that must be a government problem. It is not a government problem. I saw it in big private sector enterprises where the business units wanted to maintain their own shadow staff. And the only way to make this ultimately economically efficient is to do away with the shadow staff and truly rely upon the provider.
All right. I liked what was being said about outcomes there, and specifically, what can agencies do in setting up, discussing these outcomes, possibly versus methods or process up front? What are example of outcomes that you may be looking for, and how would you specify those?
So I'll just jump in. I'll say on this, the idea of moving to a service provider isn't all that different from some of the experiences we see when implementing software. And I think a lot of us have had the experience of implementing a big software package. There's a tendency to want to overcomplicate and over-customize and over-configure, which not only add to the cost of implementation, but they also add, it's rarely acknowledged up front, but usually recognized in perfect clarity and hindsight, that it also increases cost to maintain going forward. So the ability to kind of look at the service offering and figure out how to best adopt what is being offered, and to adapt business processes on the customer side to receive the services that are being provided. That's one area. I would say the other piece is that frequently when something's being moved over, there are internal customers of the agency that's looking to become a customer itself. In other words, you have stakeholders and constituents inside your organization, and I think it's really important to engage those folks to try to define what success looks like. Because if you sit down and ask these folks, if we had a successful implementation, the organization is feeling some level of pain now, whether it's in the way we're getting service, how much it's costing, our headcount pressure. All of these things are drivers. What would success look like, and how would our lives be better? What would it look like to have a successful implementation? I think from that you get outcome-based metrics, you get quality metrics that just kind of flow from that very frank conversation. So as an example, if you're in an organization which is struggling with to keep up with the demands of HR services, your talent and recruitment and hiring functions, asking the question, what would success look like, might lead you to a conclusion that we would want to look at a metric that tells us that hiring managers are actually making more selections off of the certificates they get, right? That's an indicator that they're satisfied with the quality of the applications that are coming through the pipeline. If you get a lot of certificates coming back with non-selections, that would be an indicator that something's not right? And so those are the kinds of things that I think the frank conversation about really what a successful implementation looks like will drive you to potentially come up with.
And in the kinds of things we're talking about, there are metrics, and one should pay attention to them. One should record them. One should report them. I mean, I was in the business of in which we ran call centers. I've run call centers myself. There are standard metrics: time to answer, lost calls, handle time, callback, or one and done. Each of those is a metric. And if you go into a relationship saying, here's what we expect, here's how fast we expect our claims to be paid, here's how frequently or how quickly we expect our calls to be answered. If you set those at the outset, you'll be much better off in the long run.
Okay. Regarding talking about standard metrics, and agree that they are out there for most back office operational areas, when you think about how the government is doing work today, would you feel confident in benchmarking yourself and your operations against benchmarks that are standardized, set within industry or within public sector? And what's your thoughts on looking and comparing?
Well, there's been a major effort led by OMB and GSA to do benchmarking, which I frankly think has been a pretty well done effort, and we have much more information today than we did some 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. It's far from finished. It's a beginning. I frankly have been in enough of these different kinds of businesses that I have sort of benchmarks in my mind as to what we ought to be able to achieve. Look, government is different. Government cannot be operated like a business. It has an entirely different set of outcomes and a different set of incentives, but it can be operated in a business-like fashion. So I think it's appropriate to look at those metrics. I'll give you an example. The HR metrics, the time to hire, the measures to hire, and what have you. Frankly, if I'd had the time to hire in the private sector that we have in the public sector, I would have been looking for work. And we didn't, and frankly, I hardly ever thought about it. It wasn't a problem. But we didn't have all the constraints, the hiring constraints that we have under Title V of the statutes. So I think you can look at the measures, but then you have to modify or adjust them to recognize the reality of the constraints under which federal managers function. On the other hand, I wouldn't think that a federal department should have twice as many HR staff as a private sector HR department. It probably ought to have some more, some incremental increase, but not twice.
And I couldn't agree more with what Ned is saying. The benchmarking effort that Ned is referring to has been enormously helpful in holding up a mirror for agencies to allow themselves to compare, to like models, right? So if you assume that the government is different from the private sector, you also have to assume that there are both good and bad examples of how government agencies have solved some of these challenges and figured out ways to do things differently, better, more efficiently, and whatnot. And so when you see, it's a pretty large sample size when they go and talk to, even just the cabinet level agencies, but the benchmarking actually went much broader than that. When you look at, kind of these examples, and they're operating in different regulatory constraints, based on the agency, you see, though, that there's a range of outcomes, and there are better and worse performers, and it therefore creates, I think, the incentive to go very much in the direction that we and the taxpayers would like to see us go. I would also agree with Ned that it's not. That doesn't mean that comparison with the private sector is unrealistic or unhelpful. You just have to put it in the context in which it's given, right? So you have to assume that the models are sometimes different. The regulatory environment we operate in is very different. Our incentive structures are very different. But that also doesn't mean that we can't take good examples, learn from best practices. The private sector has been on the forefront of a number of the things that we're now trying to do in the federal government. Space consolidation is a big one. We have an initiative, the Freeze the Footprint initiative. The private sector has really led the way on this in finding ways to really reduce real estate expenditures. The federal government, learning from that example, is now sort of racing to catch up, and some agencies are doing very, very well with this. Other agencies are still struggling. But having those, I think, private sector benchmarks gives us maybe something to aspire to. I wouldn't say the private sector is always better at these things. In fact, there are some things government does much better than the federal government, than the private sector. But I think the comparison is useful. I wouldn't necessarily be a slave to it.
Okay. In what ways can agencies tie the costs that they are incurring today with the services that they're delivering? How can they use metrics and more closely align, these are the costs, but these are going to be the services and the outcomes that we're trying to deliver?
I think some agencies have really gone farther than others in trying to do more activity-based costing. I think that's one way to start to benchmark what it currently costs an agency, and the more rigorously they can apply that model. It's not the only model, but obviously it's one that a lot of agencies haven't necessarily become very mature in. That's one way to try to compare maybe apples to apples with what a service might cost them coming from a shared service provider. I'd also say that we're seeing some of the shared service providers are moving to more of a transaction-based service model, which actually can be very helpful because it can actually get much more granular in figuring out what things actually cost. The past, I think, was many agencies would offer services on a if we're servicing this number of FTE, then we are going to charge you this much, which is really just a way for the shared service provider to staff up to support that. If you have 100 FTE, then I'm going to bring on 30 people to support those 100 or whatever the case may be, or one extra person for every 100, whatever the model is. In my mind, it's a little more attenuated, but it's really glorified staff augmentation. You're paying them to hire staff to support you, but it's the same kind of thing. I would say the more we get to the transaction-based costing, the easier it is, I think, for agencies to do better comparisons, also to control their costs, and to really they can make more of a handover between the servicing internally and getting services from a shared service provider. They also could consider having two shared service providers lined up, each one providing transaction-based services. In that particular scenario, they would maintain, and the agency would maintain more control over how the services are provided and the ability to kind of play them off of each other to get the kind of assurances they need on service quality and cost control.
Kevin, let me describe what we do with our Program Support Center, which is, as I said before, the largest shared service provider in the government. It was created in the 90s by Vice President Greer in the so-called Reinventing Government efforts, and it's an enterprise fund. The requirement is that it fully recover its costs. So what do? Well, Paul Bartley has a group of 5 portfolio managers who report to him, and they have service directors who report to them. It is a kind of a classic hierarchy. And the service directors are business owners. You might think of it in the Procter & Gamble model with people who are brand managers. Each of them owns some brand, whether it's Tide or Dove or something else. And ours own travel or acquisitions or occupational health or other things. And in each case, we require those service directors to zero base budget every year. They have to start from scratch and describe exactly what it's going to cost them to provide each service. And then we go to the customers and say, okay, here's what it's going to be in the coming year. That is a fairly uncommon thing for federal finance people. Federal finance people largely think in terms of appropriations finance rather than cost-based finance. But in this case, it's the right way to do it. Not that the other way is not right in the government. It's exactly right. You do need to do appropriations accounting. But for an outfit like the Program Support Center, you really need to do true, careful, from the beginning cost accounting. And that's the discipline to which we hold ourselves. And over the last 5 years, we've had very, very few, count them on the fingers of 2 hands, increases in prices and lots of reductions.
That's fantastic. I'm very excited to hear about transaction-based costing model. Clearly, in the commercial sector, this is being utilized for any number of services, where you can select off of a schedule and say, this is the cost for each of my general ledger or AP or AR transactions, and I would like to be able to adopt that, and I will be able to project my cost based on what I know is going to be occurring. Do you think that would be a model that would help entice or motivate further shared service adoption, moving to a transaction-based cost model?
I guess that the answer ought to obviously be yes. Andrew alluded to it before. You need to create the expectation that what you're going to do is improve things for your customer. And if you can do that, and you then perform, the customers will be happy and more will come.
I think it makes it a little less scary because it sort of feels like you can dip your toe in the water. You can go in as deep as you're comfortable, right? So you can dip your toe in the water, you could dive in head first, and you could do anything in between. And I think it allows for kind of a way to scale up into the model versus having to kind of dive in. And that's I think what has been an impediment for many agencies up until now. So this movement is one that I think it shows sophistication on the part of the shared service providers. It also shows that there's a real responsiveness to what it takes for customers to feel comfortable adopting the service.
Okay. All right. What advice would you give to business partners, or I guess providers, on how to better align with agencies in order to be able to better deliver value that they would be looking for? What advice would you give?
I guess I first have to know who you're talking about as business partners. I can be Andrew's business partner. I have been in my career a common law partner, and if you're really a partner, you in fact share revenues and expenses, profits and losses. So when you say partner, Kevin, who are you talking about?
Say a federal shared service partner, for instance.
All right, so I could be Andrew's partner through my Program Support Center, and what that requires is me to be able to show him what we do, commit to doing it, and then do it.
I think that's very well put. It has a lot to do with trust. I guess I would also say, I would add that we hear about agencies being afraid to kind of get into this field. We also hear there are instances where things haven't gone so well and agencies have tried to sort of back out of the model. But what we don't hear very often is that you really don't see agencies trying to get out of a shared service where they're getting high quality, even if the cost is a little bit higher. I think most people are happy to pay a little bit extra if they feel like their needs are being met, and that's the key. The key differentiator is that it's really about the value. If the agency feels like they are getting a good deal, they're getting what it is that they need, and they're able to really drive their mission. They're able to tap into greater expertise, greater scale, greater scope, greater capacity than they would have on their own. Then you see very little resistance to remaining in fact, further adopting the model. And that's what what the partners, whether they're internal or external, need to really focus on, is how they can continue to deliver against customer expectations and really earn the trust that Ned is referring to.
Okay, that's great advice. We had questions from our audience about new technologies like cloud computing. And how is that changing or potentially changing the way that federal agencies may look at managed services? Will that decrease costs, increase risk? What are your thoughts on new technologies?
Well, I guess it's like if I ran a transportation operation. I got to get people to and from wherever they have to go on time, acceptable cost. And if I decide to buy Buicks rather than Fords, or decide to buy Yugos rather than Cadillacs, that's a tool. I view cloud computing as very important, but don't get me wrong. By the way, I do not undersell the importance of that notion and the ultimate security it's going to provide us. But it's a tool. It's not the shared service itself, it seems to me. And the shared service providers are going to use it if, as, and when it pays, and they won't use it to whatever extent it doesn't.
And I think that's exactly right. I think I would say, though, that the model, the concept of cloud computing is one that is potentially changing mindsets about how services are delivered. I mean, these are what were formerly very complex, difficult to implement, difficult to deliver services that are being able to, the model allows them to now be delivered on tap. And what I think that does is it has, I believe I've seen a shift in some of the perceptions of how services can be acquired. And there's even more, I think, both in the consumer world and the government space, there's more of an expectation that services can be delivered in a more agile, secure, robust, and easy to implement, easy to deliver as a service. And it is something that I think has the potential to really change the way people perceive, this entire field. I think that, going a step further, as Ned was saying, the cloud services certainly can allow for greater efficiency, and they certainly allow for potentially more capacity. But in my mind, the biggest potential impact is the impact that it could have on how folks perceive how they buy services. And the whole idea of platform as a service is really, I think, getting some traction because people are increasingly comfortable with the idea of these services.
People have to get over the notion that they have to be able to go down the hall or up 3 flights and hug their server.
That's right.
We had people who always wanted, "Where's my server? Where's my server?" And the answer to that is, "Who cares?" Right. But it's really an important tool. That's why I want to be sure I don't denigrate it. It's very important.
Okay, we had another question, and if you put on your hat as a provider, how do you prioritize and sequence? Specifically, say a customer comes to you and they want to bring work to you. How do you decide to take on work or work that they may have that either fits within your model or look at opportunities to take on value creation or new opportunities of work that they may not do? How do you work with customers in that regard?
Well, I'll jump in on this one. I think I've said it publicly before, but when I was hired to work at Interior, my mandate was actually to shut down the shared service provider at the Department of the Interior, then called the National Business Center. I think one of the challenges that they faced was that there was a perception that the organization was far more interested in external business than they were in internal business. External meaning other federal agencies compared to business inside the Department of the Interior. I don't think that was really true. It was a perception, but it was driven by the fact that the organization was given a mandate to expand its portfolio, and it did, and it expanded in maybe a lot of the wrong ways. It expanded in terms of the scope of the organization, the costs increased. They didn't really sort of pay attention to driving efficiency on scale, I think, or at least in hindsight as well as they could have. But more importantly, they also expanded in terms of the scope of the organization. They had 8 lines of business running all sorts of, services from aviation to land appraisals to, the sort of the core finance, HR, IT. And so, it was a distraction, and the constant pursuit of new business did, in fact, lend itself to the perception that they were uninterested in servicing their home organization. That was a very, very precarious place for them to be. After some analysis and study, I concluded that it really wasn't in the department's best interest, and I made the case to departmental leadership. The decision was made to keep them, but to dramatically transform the organization so that they really were focused on their core business. And so ultimately, those 8 lines of business went down to 3: HR, financial management, and acquisition. And so, to sort of get to the heart of the question is, I think, really prioritizing where to bring on new customers. The organization has to be really honest with itself. Where are our core competencies, and where do we really bring value to our customers, and where, by expanding, do we bring value to the entire customer base? So by bringing on a large new customer, does it allow us to then add features and capability that we could offer to our entire customer base? Those are I think the kinds of questions that the shared service providers really need to be asking themselves before they sort of jump feet first into a new line of business or a new customer engagement.
Hear, hear. I mean, the base rule is don't do something you can't do, and we try not to. Now, I think the suggested or the implied choice between serving your home agency and serving the other customers is a false choice. You can do both. We don't think of it that way. To be sure, if you can't take care of home, you can't take care of anybody else. It's that simple. We provide more services, more different kinds of services, more varied services than they do at Interior. But we have great regard for what they do, and Andrew did focus them a lot. They've become, I think, even better at what they do, and they are very good at it. But they don't do things they can't do, and we won't either.
There's a number of agencies today who are looking at federal shared services, certainly looking at adoption for themselves. They're also looking at internal shared service models and questioning, should I get my own house in order first? Should I get the should I get my diverse geography all on using one system or all on using one process before I go to a federal shared service provider? What would your advice be on trying to do an internal fix before movement?
I don't know that I'd recommend sequencing it necessarily that way. It might introduce, there's a certain amount of inertia. Once you get onto a particular platform, there's inertia from moving off of it, right? So if the goal is to ultimately move in a particular direction, I would just try to skip as many steps as possible and get there in a thoughtful way. I would say, though, that getting the house in order does make sense. I think there's consolidation that agencies can do internally to prepare themselves, for this kind of movement. So, for example, if you have a very large agency that's got multiple independently operating subcomponents and they each have their own duplicative function, it would probably make some sense to at least consider whether it makes sense to pull those duplicative functions into a single organization and then move some of those services out. I wouldn't necessarily go to an intermediate step of launching, let's say, a brand new, fully branded service, then, sort of hand that over to a provider, because that probably won't happen if I had to guess. But I think there's value in trying to pull the operating components together, pull the functions together, and then as part of the rationalization of the services, explore, do we build this internally? Do we go externally? It's the build versus buy sort of analysis that a lot of us go through.
I agree with Andrew about the sequencing. I don't think you can make it that simple. Sometimes it might be better, in fact, to create a capacity that primarily serves outside and your inside sub-agencies will see it and be interested. When Andrew describes big, complex enterprises, we're probably the ultimate of that. We've got $1 trillion operation and 10 operating divisions and, I don't know, 17 or so staff divisions, and they each have, many of them have their own appropriations, and many of them have subdivisions which have their own appropriations. That creates ambiguity that's very difficult to deal with, and it may just be that it's better to experiment in smaller groups or within the agency for some but not all. And frankly, I don't have any kind of authority that says to 10 staff divisions, you will do it this way. That just wouldn't work, and perhaps shouldn't work. Certainly wouldn't work at my level.
Okay. All right, I know that we're wrapping up time here, so just summarizing, a majority of agencies today are using services contracting to some degree or another. They're utilizing, whether it be staff augmentation, or they're looking at adoption of some level of internal or intra or external shared service type capacity. What specific actions would you recommend that agencies can do to save money and yet still reach their mission targets most efficiently?
Well, I think it's not so much the agencies. I think as a practical matter, those organizations that have cross-governmental responsibilities need to provide leadership here. By that I mean GSA, OPM, OMB. They can encourage us and they can facilitate us to do things together, and in the end, hopefully, do them better for the taxpayers. That's where I think the action has to be.
I would absolutely agree. There's a lot more the government can do and should be doing to embrace more of a shared services model. I think that there's a lot of talk and work in this capacity. There are a lot of very smart people thinking about this quite a bit, and I believe that there's a lot of real opportunity for the government. I think that for agencies that are really struggling, my advice would be, in keeping with the study, staff augmentation is a very tricky thing. There are times when the flexibility of a staff augmentation model may be what you need, but you have to recognize that you are paying significantly more. We've always found, I think you said, Kevin, it was up to 80%. We've always found that it's a minimum of an additional 30% you're paying for if you have a like-for-like services, one FTE versus another, whether it's a onboard or a contractor-provided staff augmentation person. And so, as I said, sometimes flexibility is what you need, but a lot of times, what I think you miss is that you still maintain the control. You don't get any relief from the sort of the management responsibility of operating, of overseeing how that work gets done. And so, I think agencies should really take a hard look at where they could potentially buy, true sort of, relief from the need to sort of keep these things running in a very efficient way. At the same time, I think the providers need to really focus on how they meet their customers' mission requirements, how they deliver value to their customers, and really think about their governance models and how they bring their stakeholders into the conversation about service delivery, new features and capability that they're providing. There's a lot of sort of, I think that it goes back to Ned's earlier point about trust. There's a lot that the shared service provider community needs to do to continue to earn the trust of their customers. But I'm very excited because I think for the first time in quite a while, I feel like we're really poised to see some real movement in this area.
I would agree. I think the landscape's set, and we've never heard more discussions about shared services today. Certainly at the highest level of government, the opportunity for change. I think your comments are spot on, and I appreciate your time, both Andrew Jackson and Ned Holland, for coming out and sharing your stories and perspectives on overall shared service capability. So thank you.